Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Air War podcast presented by Pursuit Picks Media. And we've got a cool episode today. Sam and I have both been doing our own individual traveling, and we're going to be dedicating some episodes to things that we've been able to go out and see. And we're going to start off this string of episodes with Sam. He went to the Royal Air Force Museum in Cosford. Is it in Cosford? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So what is Cosford for those of us Americans who don't know?
So it's a small town in Shropshire, which is basically the smack bang in the middle of the UK. It was an active RAF base. Now it's still run by the RAF as a training facility, but the only aircraft flying out of there is the Air Ambulance Service, who are obviously civilians. And they decided, I think it was in the 1960s, they were just going to open up a museum for the RAF in the Midlands, so not everything was centred in London. And if I change side, that is me standing on the train platform, and you've got the airfield right there.
So this was an airfield during World War II.
Oh yeah.
What was there?
It was a training squadron, and I was a fighter squadron. I can't remember the name of the squadron, but it was with the Midlands group.
Okay.
During the Battle of Britain. And then later on, when Fighter Command started slimming down, you'd see less aircraft and less squadrons in this part of England just because there was no point in having them here.
Okay.
And so the fighters shifted to the continent and into the coastal command areas. No one's going to come from the Midlands. There's a few fighter squadrons to hit the long-range German base, long-range German bombing raids, but that's about it. So
this was more of an auxiliary base during the war.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it did have, during the early part of the war, 1940-41, it was busy, but after then it just sort of died down because, like I said, the war shifted to other places.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but like I said, that's me. I've just stepped off the train there, and I've got the airfield right in front of me. And so you'll have to forgive the weather as well, but it's typically English.
Yeah, sure. Sets the mood.
So, yeah. So you got about an 800 or so walk along the road. And then you're presented with this. It's the visitor centre. This isn't my picture. I've copyrighted the chap at the bottom. I forgot to take a picture of it because when I got off the train, it just started to absolutely cack it down with rain. And this RAF sergeant, he was driving along, offered me a lift. So he gave me a lift to the front door.
Oh, that's cool.
I know. I'd say they're such a friendly bunch of chaps. Yeah. So you come out of here and you can see on the back side of that building there, you're presented with a couple of aircraft outside. First one is this Neptune.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually an American aircraft, and it was only used with Coastal Command for, I think it's about 5 years, from 52 to 57. It was just a stopgap while they were waiting for the Shackleton to come in.
Yeah, one of the first aircraft to have rocket-assisted takeoff.
Yes, it did. And I only knew that by looking this up when I was preparing for this. And you've also got a Nimrod. I'll be honest with you, I know nothing about the Nimrod, apart from it was just a reconnaissance aircraft during the later period of the Cold War. That's literally all I know about it. So, sorry for you Cold War fans. There's also this as well. It's a trainer. I've got no idea. Sorry. There is literally no notes on these, because I've been looking. I've got buckets full of notes for all the World War II aircraft, but I was saying to Mitch before we started, for a lot of the Cold War era stuff and some of their less popular artifacts, there is very little information about them, so I can't even tell you how these came to be at the museum or anything like that, I'm afraid. But as you go in past this, you've got the first hangar. The museum's made up of 3 hangars which hold all the aircraft, and then the visitor centre, which I showed you before, but there's nothing in there apart from a cafe. Also that, just before you get into the first hangar, PBY Catalina, which I thought you'd appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's we had a lot of PBYs flying around in this area since I'm just off the west coast, so a lot of patrolling for Japanese submarines.
Yeah, of course. And because to be fair, it's rather odd to see one of these in the Midlands, just because
that's a ways away from the coast.
Yes,
right.
And it's literally the centre of the United Kingdom. You cannot get more centre than this. And so it's very odd seeing one of these here and not in one of the Coastal Command museums or something like that. But either way, so you go into the first hangar, and you've got the first few aircraft you confronted is First World War aircraft. So this is the Sopwith Pup. It was introduced in 1916. It's one of those first few successful Royal Flying Corps aircraft that you see on the Western Front. But as you get into about 1917, it's very quickly overshadowed by later German aircraft models. So it just gets sent back to England, and it's used for combating the Zeppelin and the Gotha bomber raids on the UK. But interestingly enough, the US Navy used a lot of these in flying experiments when they were trying out their first aircraft carriers. And this is one of the first planes to fly off the turret of a battleship in the United States Navy. It flew off the USS Idaho. Yeah. And so that's a nice little tidbit. I don't know if if that is this aircraft. It could be. I've read one source that said it could be. Then we got the Strutter. It's a multi-role aircraft. It's a two-seater. It's not a very effective fighter, but it's an okay ground attack aircraft, so they kept them around. Oddly enough, the French during World War I had more of these than we did. The Royal Flying Corps and the RAF had about 1,300. The French had about 4,000, and they just did not get on with them for some reason. I'm not sure why. Bristol MC, only 130 of these built. There's not much to say about it, really. It was only really,
for sure.
Yeah, it was only really used in Palestine and Salonika. There's one ace pilot who got his fourth and fifth kills in one of these, but that was against the Bulgarians, whose manufacturing of aircraft wasn't exactly great. So, yeah, it's a crap aircraft, really. It was the only proper monoplane fighter for the Royal Flying Corps during World War One. Hawker Hind, and you can see just behind there. Sadly, I can't find a picture I took of it, but there's a Hawker Hart behind it. These are interwar RAF bombers, light bombers. And in fact, this Hind is from the Royal Afghanistan Air Force, which is a very odd one. It was sent to the Afghans in the 1930s, and then they sold it back to us. Oh, no, sorry, they gifted it to us in the 1960s, I think, I'd say. But RAF pilots who flew these during the interwar years, they were rather fond of them. And say they as a light bomber, they were fairly quick. They could outrun their contemporary fighters at the time. But apart from some mild use in some colonial conflicts, they weren't really used at all, sadly. Gloucester Gladiator. Now, Mitch knows I love the Gladiator.
Now we're in World War II. Properly in World War II.
Yeah, we're finally here now. And so this Gladiator is painted up in 247 Squadron. They flew Gladiators during the Battle of Britain. They were stationed in Plymouth, which is in Cornwall, Devon area in the southwest of England. They were used on one occasion in daylight, and they couldn't shoot anything down, and they had to get help from some hurricanes. They were later then. This particular squadron was later then used only for night fighting, but then very quickly they just got the aircraft replaced with hurricanes because it wasn't up to the job really against modern German aircraft. And so I think the squadron lost 3 to 109s and for nothing in return. So it was, but despite its naff use,
well, the Gladiators everywhere at the beginning of the war,
everywhere, and so it does surprisingly well against Italian aircraft, especially in Malta, North Africa, and in East Africa.
Yeah.
In fact, in East Africa, this is all there was. They didn't have any hurricanes yet. They didn't have anything that could be classed as a contemporary modern fighter.
Yeah, there's a handful that go to the Finns. There's a handful that go over to Norway. There's a really interesting history tied with the Gladiator and particularly Gloucester, who are manufacturing these at the beginning of the war. And then in 1945, they're producing the Meteor. They go from biplanes to jets in a span of about 6 years. It's pretty remarkable.
Apart from some minor trial aircraft and some trainers, that's all they do is biplanes to jets.
Mm-hmm.
That's literally it. And so I've also found two sources that say there was a Gloucester in the Philippines as well in 41.
Oh, wow.
And say, I don't know how it got there. And say, no one seems to explain that, but apparently it was...
Take a pretty good guess at what happened to it.
I wonder what could have happened to it. And say, but as far as I've heard, no one knows quite what happened to that specific one. But probably captured or shot down. And say, because I don't really fancy flying one of these against a Zero, would you?
No, not in the slightest. But there's also plenty of American planes at this part in the war where I would not want to be flying against the Zeke.
Yeah. And so I'd even have to think twice about it in a hurricane, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Here we are. Now, I don't think the Spitfire needs much introduction, really, does it? But this particular one, now, where have I put in my notes? So this particular one, it was with a squadron during the very early part of the war. It flew missions over Dunkirk, but on the 4th of June it crashed. So after that, it was taken back into a training role in, I think it was 57 Training Squadron. And so sadly, it didn't really get much of a service life. It didn't have any confirmed kills. It didn't attack any ground targets. It was just... I'd say this is fairly standard for most of the surviving aircraft. It was just a survivor, really. I think that's what can be said for most most of the World War II aircraft these days. But then we go on to the 109, because that's just opposite the Spitfire as well.
So this is Black 6, correct?
It is, yes.
Okay.
And they captured in North Africa in 1942, just outside of Tobruk. I don't know if you can see it, but just on the picture with the engine, just below it, you can just about see this picture here.
Yeah.
That is RAF crew climbing all over the aircraft to have a good look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And say, sadly, I forgot to take a picture of that. But apparently I've read somewhere, and you'll know this better than I do, that some of them had a cannon running through the engine.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah, they had it running through. Yeah, it would fire through the center of the propeller hub. So at like the 109, so the E series has the 220 mils in the wings, and then your 792 two machine guns in the nose, and then some of them did have an additional cannon firing through the propeller hub. Now, what they did on the F and the G series, for the most part, is everything was stored in the nose. Excuse me. So you would have. And they went from 8mm Mauser to basically a 50 cal on their machine guns. It kind of depends on the variant. And then they would hold on to the 20mm. And then eventually later ones, when they started encountering American bombers, they went to the 30mm. So it depends.
Okay, yeah.
But you can see here that this is you said a G2?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this would probably have the single 20mm and the two either 8mm or 250 cals in the nose with it.
And that's a decent bit of firepower for something of the early half of the war as well. And say, because I'm trying to think when the Spitfires switched over to 50 calibers, and I want to say it's late 40, early 41, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it might even be later than that. I'm not sure you see E-Wing Spitfires until
you're right.
Mark 9.
Yeah, which is mid to late 42, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this one used to fly, by the way. I'm pretty sure Black 6 used to fly. Yes. I don't know if they had any info on that.
All I found was that it was captured in North Africa, sadly.
Yeah, I think this was a somewhat regular airshow performer in the UK, and then it crashed on landing, I believe, about 25 years ago.
That exact thing of crashing on landing used to be flying comes up so often in this presentation. Yeah. It is disturbing how often this happens. In fact, talking of cannons and machine guns, they are the RAF's what the RAF aircraft would be used in during the war. So you've got at the top there, you've got the 303. If I go back to the Spitfire, as you can see, it's these holes in the wing here. as I'm sure you all know. They're where the 303 are. Then they switch over to the 50 cals eventually, which, there we are. So the gun itself is starting to see service in 41.
Yeah.
And so that is that going to be the Mark V then?
I don't know if it made it onto any of them prior to the Mark 9. I don't know my Spitfires that well.
No,
but
my
I
shame, neither do I.
Yeah, I think the E-wing is where you start seeing the 50 cal go into the Spitfires.
Yeah. And the third row, you've got the 20mm Hispano. These are what's going to be on your Hurry bombers and the like, which I'll come on to again in a minute.
One of the best aerial mounted cannons in the war.
If you look into the Mark V, which you see later in the war, that's serving on Hawker Hunters.
Yeah.
And the 20mm Hispano is just an absolutely brilliant cannon. And so you really can't ask for better than that. And it says here that it's a French company, but I'm pretty sure Hispano is Spanish and Swiss. But I'll let them say that. This was one of the nicer pieces for me. So that is the uniform dress of Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, who was the CNCF fighter commander in the Battle of Britain. That's his actual dress uniform that he wore during the battle at Bentley Priory. And say that it's showing a bit of wear and tear, but it's still in one piece.
It's got some moth pitting there, but that's all right. I mean, that's just that's 1940s uniforms for you.
Well, exactly. I'm surprised it's still in this good of a condition. On his medal room in here, sadly there's not that many, meritorious service. I think it's 7 altogether. No, it's not. It's 9 altogether. Sorry, and I think 6 of them are medals for coronation duty and stuff like that. So George V, George VI, and then Queen Elizabeth II, their coronations and the funerals as well for those various monarchs. Interestingly enough, the last one here, the green, white, and green, is actually an Iraqi medal from King Faisal in 1935. That's an interesting one there for you. So, Hurricane Mark II, which its more famous brother is the Hurry bomber. This particular Hurricane, it was made in March 44, and it was one of the last few to be built, and it was only used as a training aircraft. But as I mentioned, the 20 mils before, you'd see these Mark IIs with your 20 mils.
Yeah, so the C-wing, I think, is 420 millimeters.
Yeah, and so it's 420 mils, and then I can't remember if the ones fitted with the bomb carriages have a separate designation. I think it's just the C's. I can't remember if they gave it a separate designation. But these basically replaced the Fairy Battles. The Fairy Battle is the light bomber that the RAF started with during the first part of the war. It's not great. I love it for some odd reason, but it's not great. And they start taking Hurricanes and starting using them in ground attack roles, and as Spitfires come in to replace the Hurricane squadrons. So, is it just me, or do you think the Hurry bomber doesn't get the attention and love it deserves?
Well, the Hurricane, I think the Hurricane in general is similar to what we have with the Wildcat for the Americans, where the Wildcat held the line until we could get the Hellcat and other, better performing aircraft. Doesn't necessarily mean the Hellcat was crappy, because it wasn't. Obviously, it underperformed against the Zero, but we had very skilled pilots. And it's similar to this, where the Hurricane, you had a lot of them. They were very reliable. They were also pretty rugged, from what I've read. And because there were a lot of them, they were able to hold the line, and they were everywhere.
Oh, God. Yeah. And so I think, is it about 2/3 of all Hurricanes end up in the USSR as well?
Wow. I did not know that.
I think it's either half or 2/3, and they just get shunted the Russians' way, because obviously we don't want to give them Spitfires. Well, too many Spitfires anyway. And the Hurricane, although not great against the, well, almost any 109. In large enough numbers, as we see, they can do the job. And saying, especially if they're also used in the ground attack role, like we see with the Hurry Bomber, they can do the job. That's why most of those end up in the USSR. And plus, obviously, Churchill decided to promise probably more stuff to the Russians than we could actually give, even with the US and the UK industry combined. It was just, we promised too much, so that's why we have to send so much stuff over to them. But yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a Hurricane in person with this paint scheme as well, because this is the later, I want to say it starts seeing that in 42, 43 in Northwest Europe.
So for the listening audience, this is the gray and green.
Oh, yes, of course.
Kind of the splotch style camo.
Yeah.
And often the Hurricane is associated with, the Western Desert, tan and brown, and then, or the Battle of Britain, green and
brown.
Yeah, green and brown. And then occasionally you see some black on it too.
Well, talking of black, if I've got my slides right, Bolton Bull Defiant. God, this thing is awful.
Yeah, that is one ugly looking plane for sure.
Even I can't defend this. So it started its service life intended as a fighter. It wasn't. It was awful. It couldn't go up against anything and have a chance of succeeding.
It's a concept that didn't last long, right? So this is that early part of World War II, and even prior to World War II, where we've got monoplanes that are capable of more than 300 miles an hour. So let's test out some ideas. And there's not many aircraft that fit in the category of turret fighter. This might be the only one. Maybe the only one people have heard of for sure. But the idea of the Defiant was an interceptor. You put a turret in the back with 4 guns. Typically, in a turret configuration, there's 1 or 2. But you put 4 in the back, and then you go shoot down bombers.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a bad idea on paper at the time, because the war hasn't broken out yet. You don't know how this is going to go, and it sounds pretty good.
And so it does. In fact, to be fair, I've heard a story. I can't confirm it. It might be a load of crap. But apparently, when they first came up against 109s, the 109s came in from the probably about the 5 o'clock position, expecting to get an easy kill on a section of these, and they got blown out of the air by the rear turrets because they weren't expecting them. I haven't been able to confirm it. It's just a story I've heard. Part of me wants to believe it. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that was something that happened on probably few occasions.
Yeah.
And then once they realize how to take it down, these get withdrawn from service fairly quickly.
Yeah, they do stick around in the night fighter role for a little while. In fact, this one in particular is it was assigned to 307 Polish Squadron as a night fighter, given that so for the listening audience, it's got a black paint scheme on it, which is for all nighttime operation aircraft. Yeah, they are just, in the RAF, they're just painted pure black. And so that's the only really role that it does well in, is as a night fighter when bombers are really going to struggle to defend themselves. I think
this is the only example of this aircraft.
This is the only one left. And so I don't know if there are any of the because I know they made some prototypes for expanding on this design. I don't know if any of they survive. I doubt it. But now what's left? Talking of turreted fighters, aircraft that aren't great. The Blenheim. It was envisioned as a light bomber. I don't really rate the Blenheim. I want to like it, but I can't give it much credit, really. And I was talking to Mitch before we started. This is actually a Bolingbroke, which is the contracted version of the Blenheim for the Royal Canadian Air Force. But it was taken over by the Royal Air Force Museum in I want to say the 70s or the 60s. And it was brought for $200 Canadian, and then they decided, well, the Bolingbroke's not important, so we'll just rebuild it as a Blenheim. And to be fair, they've done a good job of it, because it looks beautiful.
It looks great.
Yeah. But the Blenheim itself as an aircraft, I don't rate it. It's too... Even for a light bomber, it's not until later on, so for example, this the Mark IV, you don't have a significant enough payload. And it's slow, and it doesn't turn well. And it just doesn't do anything well. I don't know what you think of it.
Yeah, other than the really cool flyover it does in Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, I've never really given these much thought. I did see one of these in Brussels, and they're cool looking planes.
Yeah,
but again, it's one of those interwar aircraft that didn't perform well early on, and there's reasons you don't hear much about.
Yeah.
Your Defiance and your ferry battles and your Blenheims.
See, part of me would class this, because even though it's designed as a light bomber, I'd say it's more of a medium, apart from it hasn't got the payload.
Right.
Because of its handling. I personally, I class it as more of a medium bomber, but I'm not in the RAF or the development department in 1930s, so I'm not going to argue with
So
them.
It's a 1,200-pound payload.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine at the time it was designed, which is late 30s. That's not too bad.
Which mark is it? Which mark are you looking at?
This is the Mark IV.
Yeah, so Mark
it's the same one.
The Mark IVs turn up in around 1940, late 39, 40, I want to say.
Okay.
And say when the payload has been increased, but it's only in late 40 where you see these in the Mark IVs in decent enough numbers where that payload becomes a matter of importance.
Sure.
And say, I want to like it, but I can't. Tiger Moth. I have nothing to say about it other than Tiger Moth.
Yeah, it's just one of those trainer aircraft you had to have. Yeah. Everybody would have flown one of these.
Oh, yeah. And so, actually, either these or a Miles Magister, which I have got a picture of later as well. But yeah, this is just your basic trainer aircraft. I think Prince Philip, the former husband of the late Queen, trained to fly in one of these in the 50s. And so that goes to show how long they were used for, because they are good trainers. And so they're just a basic, solid aircraft, and they just teach you the basics, really. Wellington. So, Vickers Wellington, I like them. I think they're a good aircraft. You've got a decent payload with them. They handle fairly decently for a bomber. They do suffer from some technical problems with... I can't remember what it is now. Have I written it down in my notes? No, I haven't. Ignore me. They do have second technical problems, which I can't remember what they are. But they are pretty much one of the staple aircraft for the RAF Bomber Command in the early part of the war. In fact, it's some Wellingtons along with some Whitleys that go and bomb Berlin in 1940, which is the first, obviously the first raid on Berlin of the war. It's an important aircraft just because it filled a stopgap before you get your Halifaxes, basically. I think that's the best way to describe these.
Yeah, for sure. It held the line until you could get to the better, higher performing aircraft.
Yeah, and so because I want to say these come in about 1938 or so.
Over 11,000 made. I did not realize that.
Yeah, they made a lot, and it's a shame it's the same as the Whitworths, which are the largest bomber during the late interwar and the early part of the war for the RAF, even though they only have 2 engines. For some reason, the RAF catches on very late with the 4-engine configuration, and I don't get why. And so that just seems daft to me, but this is me talking here. And so here's some, as you can see there on the picture on the right, for those who are watching, they've taken out the rear turret. They've taken out the rear turret because you can actually look inside, which I thought was very cool. And it's not roped off or anything, if you see that.
Unbelievable. Look at that.
Yeah, you can just stand right. I stood right in the entrance just looking up. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, it looks messy. Do you get what I mean?
That is terrifyingly cramped.
Yeah. And plus, I'm trying to think of the crew configuration, because you've got your bombardier, you've got your wireless operator, you've got your navigator, you've got the pilot and co-pilot, you've got the front turret and rear turret, and that's it really, isn't it? There isn't any protection for your flanks, is there?
Mm-hmm.
Is there? Yeah, no, it's just the sides. There's no protection for the sides. And I sort of get why they did that, but at the same time, it's an obvious flaw, I think. Because this was before Bomber Command developed its night bombing doctrine. This was a daylight bomber intended to be. So I don't know why they left those flanks exposed. But oh well. So
probably there's no room to put guns. That'd be my guess. I mean, where the hell are you going to put a gun?
I think you could do it.
Oh, I'm sure you could, but it would be really. But you would have to stagger them, like they did with the later, like the B-17G.
Yeah,
is where they realized they had to stagger the waist guns and the fuselage.
But I'm thinking, what, Vickers K guns? Even that is something. Just some Vickers K guns out the sides. It just gives an ability to have some sense of defense,
right?
And so they are fairly decent aircraft, but I just wouldn't want to fly in one in a combat situation.
Right.
I wouldn't want to do it.
I'd rather be in a B-25 if we're talking twin-engine bombers.
I'd rather be on the ground. Yeah, this is just some of the just some bombs that the RAF as a whole used, not just the Wellington. And say you'll see these bombs right through the end of the war. Right, this is a story I've been looking forward to. So that is Cyril Barton. That's his VC, his actual jacket, his medal ribbons, everything. That's actually the first VC I've seen in person. I've never seen one in person before. So, Cyril Barton, he was piloting the Halifax in 1944. I've written the date down. March 44, that's it. He's on a raid over Nuremberg. And he gets jumped by a 88 and a 210. He's got a fuel leak in both tanks. The starboard engine is knackered. Well, it's still working, but it's giving him a lot of trouble. The radio's knocked out. The rear turret's not working. It's jammed in I think it's a right-facing angle. So he goes full Rosie Rosenthal on an 88, turns the aircraft so the front turret has a shot, and they shoot down the 88, which I think is very impressive.
That's insane.
In a Halifax. And the 210 just disappears. They don't know where it goes. So obviously, while this is happening, the radio operator, the navigator, and the wireless radio man, the bombardier, and the navigator all bail out because the intercom isn't working. They think they have to bail out because they're under attack, and they leave. It just leaves him and the gunners. That's it. There isn't anyone else. So rather than doing a sensible thing and going for home, Cyril decides to carry on to the target, gets to Nuremberg, goes down into the bombardier's position and drops the bombs himself. As he comes back up and he turns to head for home, the starboard engine blows up. There's a fire. He dives down to put the fire out, which thank God he does. He's only at about anywhere between 500 and 700 feet off the ground the whole time. He's just about able to get over some hills in the Black Forest, just about. He navigates by himself while flying the aircraft that he's running on one engine all the way back to Britain, and he ends up over the coast of Britain about 90 miles north of his base. He's in Durham. He's meant to be in Lincoln. Decides that he can't gain any height because he's only got one engine, so the crew can't bail out. So he's got no choice but to put it down. So he's trying to put it down. At the last minute, he sees some houses, so he has to swerve off. Very forceful impact onto the ground. He's severely wounded, but all the crew are okay because of his very quick thinking. He's pulled out alive, but sadly dies a few days later. And this is why they say the Victoria Cross is only won by people with a death wish. Because this man is just... I'll admit, I didn't know Cyril Barton's story until I came to Cosford and saw these medals, and I was like, I wanted to look into this. What a bloody madman.
Yeah.
You just go home. As soon as you got damage, I'd just go home. I think any normal person would. It takes a special kind of courage to continue and then go through everything else he has to go through in the end.
Right.
And so yeah, a well-deserved VC. And on the topic of VCs, this is Jamie Nicholson. He's the only Battle of Britain VC, the only one awarded to Fighter Command. God, tell me a date there. I think I've forgotten the date. Height of the Battle of Britain. He's flying in a Hurricane on the south coast. He's shot up by a 109, and the aircraft sets on fire. So he's about to bail out. He's literally standing on the door trying to about to bail out. He sees another 109, decides, you know what, I'm going to get back into this burning Hurricane and shoot it down. So that's exactly what he does and shoots down a 109. He's very badly burnt. Finally decides it's time to get out, so actually gets out. And you'd think that would be the end of the story, but when he gets onto the ground, he's actually shot at by the Home Guard because they think he's a German.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This is one of the few VC people who won the VC who actually survived their VC action. He makes a complete recovery. He goes. He's transferred to India, where he flies Beaufighters, and then in 1945, he actually dies over Singapore flying B-24s. And so but again, another well-deserved VC, I think. And so, I don't know why Fighter Command only got one VC during that, because you know just as well as I do the insane stories of the fighter aces during the war, or even just those that didn't get fighter aces but are still very meritorious fighters.
Right.
And they don't get any VCs. One single VC. And
yeah.
Granted that VC pilots are... Granted VCs are rare during the war as they are. But, hey-oh.
So for the Americans at home, when he says VC, we're talking Victoria Cross, so that would be the equivalent of a Medal of Honor. No, it's all right. That'd be the equivalent of the American, the Medal of Honor for the Americans.
Mm-hmm. And I'd argue it rates higher than a Medal of Honor, but that's besides the point.
Oh boy, you're not going to want to touch that hot take. Let it sit for a little bit. Now this is interesting. He just pulled up a picture of a Ju-88.
One of two left?
I think you're right. That is interesting. I did not realize they had an 88. For some reason, I kept thinking they had a 111, but this is neat. because the 88's quite an aircraft.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what, you know more about the 88, so you take it away.
Well, it's the that's what I would consider the Blitz bomber.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't necessarily just that. It was what makes the 88 unique is that it was a very versatile aircraft, and this configuration, it looks like it's in the Night Fighter setup because is that Liechtenstein, the antennas on the front of the nose.
It's something daft like that, and it's something German.
Yeah, so Liechtenstein being the airborne radar that the Germans would use to pick up Allied night bombers. But this is just the 88's a really neat aircraft, and God, there were over 15,000 of them made. So this was a workhorse for the Luftwaffe.
I mean, you can see at the front there the mounting for, was it 20 mil?
Yeah, they had, and there were other versions that carried even larger cannons than that. I think you see upwards of 37 millimeter, and then some that were that would go after heavy bombers. Mm-hmm. So I think you maybe even see 50 millimeter.
Jesus Christ!
Yeah. Not many of those. Again, I mean those aircraft that were fitted with those larger cannons. There weren't many of them. They had to obviously have some modifications in order, for the aircraft to carry them. But the fact that you could take an airframe like this, modify it, put a gun like that on it, it can still fly and be somewhat effective is pretty scary and impressive.
Because it's one of those. It's basically like a kit, basically. You can do a lot of things with it. You can add a lot of things on it and take stuff off that isn't necessarily necessary and replace it with something else. It's a very good airframe to use in those particular roles anyway. But so we said obviously it's one of two surviving according to my notes.
Yeah, the other one's at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio.
Oh.
But the 88 was, I mean, it was I guess you could say this was a medium. For the Germans, it was a medium bomber, but it was a medium bomber, a heavy fighter, a torpedo bomber, maritime reconnaissance aircraft.
I think it did practically everything other than being an actual fighter, really, wasn't it?
Right.
And say
night fighter, flying bomb, too.
Yes, it was, wasn't it?
Yeah, so this was part of the Mistral program.
And say that.
Which, if you haven't heard of the Mistral program, go check that out. They would mount these would be on the bottom of something like an FW-190, and they would take it off. The aircraft were attached, and then the 190 would detach the 88, and it was a flying bomb. It was a drone, and then they would control it. You know, the idea was that they would control it into the target. And
they tried that with was it B-17s they tried that with as well?
Yeah, they did. The difference between that is the pilot, you actually had to have crewmen inside the B-17, take it off, hit a switch, and then they would bail out. The Mistral program actually had the flying aircraft, the mothership, I guess you would say, on top of the 88.
Yeah,
and then they would I don't understand how the Mistral program works, but it's pretty damn close to how I explained it. Where you'd have the aircraft mounted on top of the 88, they would take off, it would detach when the FW-190 pilot would want that to happen, and then they would basically like radar control it into whatever target they were going for.
Yeah,
not many of them, but something interesting.
I was going to say, well, talking of interesting, this particular aircraft, it only survived because the crew flew it to Scotland to desert. That's the only reason this survives, is because the crew flew it to Scotland and defected. That's it. Mm-hmm. I don't know any more specifics than that, but it's odd that that's the only way that this can survive. And it makes me wonder now how they got the other one.
I think it was probably the same way.
Yeah. Because that's also another good thing about this aircraft. It has a very decent range, and so you have a lot of options with it. Now I'm conscious of the time, so I'm probably going to speed up a little bit.
That's all right.
410. I know nothing about the 410. I'll leave it to
So this is an improvement. This is a Willy Messerschmitt design that was an improved version of the 210. The Germans were obsessed with this concept of a heavy fighter.
Yeah.
Now, probably the most well-known heavy fighter is the 110, and then there's a series within this lineage, right? So we go from the 110, the 210, and then the 410. The 410 is probably the best out of that series. And one thing that's interesting, if you look closely at this photo, that engine nacelle looks like a 109. Looks like they pulled a Daimler-Benz off of a 109 and then slapped it onto that wing. So the 410 was pretty damn terrifying to go up against if you were in a bomber formation without escort. It's a very heavily armed aircraft. It's also a very rugged aircraft. But part of the problem was when the Americans started to get longer range on their escorting fighters, heavy fighters for the Germans were pretty easy targets to shoot down. Now, this aircraft did have a tail gunner. It had two roughly 50 caliber machine guns in the back that were in a remote control style turret. And there were pilots that were shot down by those because they would get too close, and obviously those are pretty powerful defensive guns to have.
They'll rip apart a 51 or a 47 easily.
Yeah, absolutely. But the 410, it's a cool aircraft. There were not many of these made.
No.
In fact, I'm going to pull the number up real quick because I am curious. So there were just under 1,200, and this is one of two.
Yeah, this particular model was captured in Denmark in 1945. It was surrendered to the RAF regiment, actually. And say, but what sort of speed you getting out of this thing?
It's the specs here show max speed is 315 at sea level, and then 388 at 22,000 feet.
It's not terrible.
So for a heavy fighter, that's pretty impressive. And what you could put onto this aircraft in terms of firepower, you've got guns in the nose, 20 millimeter cannons. You can put gun pods on it for that additional firepower to take on bomber formations. It's got a payload here of 2,200 bombs, and then you can also put on the rockets.
Yeah,
but it's a versatile aircraft that you would not want to be in if you were taking on single or other twin engine fighters. Like the P-38 would have a field day with one of these.
Yeah, exactly. And so, because in theory, if it's very good aircraft, I'd argue, for bomber kills, like you've just said, I know, but if you're thinking only in that mindset of, I just need something to kill enemy bombers, this is perfect. You couldn't ask for better.
Yeah, and heavy fighter was not really a concept that the Western Allies picked up.
No.
I guess you could say the closest example to something like this for the RAF is the Mosquito. That's but the Mosquito was an aircraft that was a jack of all trades.
Exactly.
The Americans really don't have a heavy fighter per se. And despite what some people think, the P-38 it doesn't really fit into that category. But anyway, sorry, I'm going on a rabbit hole here.
I'm definitely with you on that. The P-38, it can handle itself unless it's in Northwest Europe.
Yeah.
And now something that you're going to find very nice, and just to make it sure that the museum hasn't forgotten the U.S. Army Air Force, they've got their own little cabinet.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. In fact, you've got one of those helmets, haven't you?
I do. That's an M3 flak helmet, so it's modified from a standard M1 helmet, and then they cut holes along the side, and then added ear flaps so you could put the helmet on over your headset over your flying helmet, and that was just to protect you from the flak.
In fact, in the background, because we were talking about the P-38, and the back of the cabinet, you've got the glass pane from the P-38.
That's cool.
And is it just patches as well? I don't know if I've mentioned it before. I like patches, and so I'm starting to collect patches now. So I want an 8th and a 9th Air Force one, so I might just break into that cabinet.
Yeah.
So they also have a short Sterling, although that's all that's left of it. It crashed in 44 and was in the Pennines. It's a mountain range up north, in the west, and it was just left there until 1972 when it was found.
And I take it those are the guys who found it. They carved put their names into it.
And part of me wonders, because another part of that Sterling is in the Imperial War Museum, and another part of it is in the RAF Museum in London. I don't think there are any short Sterlings left, are there? I'm pretty sure there isn't. I haven't got it in my notes.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there is. That's too bad.
Because I think, like we discussed in our last episode, they were a big part of the D-Day air transport operations for the British. So, moving along, V1 and V2. I have no idea how they got them. All I know is they had something to do with the British's Blackfire project, which is basically just testing everything the German had relating to rocketry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I know about these, sadly. But they are in mint condition. I think the V2 there is one of the best preserved in the world, as so I've read.
Yeah, I think there's a surprisingly large amount of these.
Of the ones or the twos?
Of both, because it's hard to find a museum, and there's a lot of replicas of the V1s. But I think just because so many were captured, and they were such a very interesting part of the aviation field, that it was they're not very. The V2 is large. I mean, it's huge. The V1 is very small, so you could see why those would, if there were a large amount of those that, well, I say large with air quotes, right? I mean, obviously there's not, we're talking maybe in the 30s or 40s, there's surviving examples of those, but it's not a very difficult thing to display.
No, and you can pretty much dump it anywhere. I think what they've got there is a little special because they've got the actual original trolley for it, which fair play.
I've never seen that.
No,
with any of the ones I've seen,
and that's also for the V1. It's also the original ramp as well.
Yeah, that's insane. That is the best part of those displays, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just a very nice display, and like you said, yes, you can display them everywhere. But I think that's why part of this has the edge as well, is because they look more natural. They're not just shoved in a corner somewhere.
Right. Yeah, suspended from a ceiling.
Oh, I'll get onto that in a minute, believe me. 190. This is the A8 version. Again, it was surrendered in Denmark, but apart from that, no information for it, sadly. And then again, I'll leave the technical bits up to you.
So this is the A8. This is a later short nose. I mean, and the majority of them were the short nose radial engine powered BMW powered aircraft. But the A8 was something that you'd probably see quite a bit in 1944 and 1945. This one looks like it's in great shape.
Oh, it's perfect. And there's one thing I should mention about this museum is it's not just my photography that's cramped. Everything is so cramped in, you can't get good pictures.
Yeah.
You can only get close-ups. That's one of my only complaints about the museum is everything is very cramped in.
Sure.
So you can't get a good look at stuff.
But the 190 is the workhorse for single-engine fighters for the Luftwaffe. This aircraft is, you could somewhat equate it to the P-47, where it's the heavier, more versatile, more rugged, bubble canopy, wide landing gear, which is huge. Pilots were certainly appreciated that, particularly guys who were going from the 109 into the 190. Excellent firepower. A lot of these had 420 millimeter cannons, and then 2 machine guns mounted up in the cowling of the nose.
Yeah, I mean, this the 190 is basically a match for almost anything it'll come up against, apart from 51Ds and some of the very latest Spitfires and the Tempests. Apart from that, it's a match for anything, really.
Yeah.
And so it's a very, very capable fighter.
Yeah, dubbed the Butcher Bird by the Brits when it came onto the scene.
Yeah, the RAF did not take well to these.
And people should look into the Kurt Tank story. It's a very Kurt Tank was the designer of the Focke-Wulf 190, but yeah, I would definitely eventually we'll have to talk about some of the aircraft designers, but Kurt Tank has a very interesting career.
I want to do RJ Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mosquito. And so, I think we talked about this earlier. It's a jack of all trades. It does practically everything, doesn't it? I'd say on the left there, on the right there, you can see the 6-pounder cannon that you'd have mounted in the nose of that thing. And I'm like, can you imagine being an aircraft firing a 6-pounder? You'd shake to death.
Yeah, especially in an autocannon configuration too.
I was going to say, as brilliant, and don't get me wrong, it was incredibly effective and it worked very well, but I would not want to be... it would be very uncomfortable, I think.
So 6-pounder is a 57 millimeter, so it's a tank cannon mounted in a twin-engine aircraft, and the Americans did that too. We did it with the B-25. We put a 75 millimeter in some of the H and Gs, and I think later the J model, because strafing in the Pacific was a big thing. But like for coastal command, you needed to have these cannon-mounted aircraft that could go out on maritime patrol, and if you hit a U-boat with one of these, especially in the conning tower, it's going to tear a hole in it.
Yeah, and then obviously, one hole wouldn't make a difference, but 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got a problem. And say, an interesting thing about this particular Mosquito. So this is technically a TT-35. It's purely a training aircraft. It didn't do anything interesting or spectacular. But this Mosquito is painted up to look like the Mosquito Guy Gibson flew on his last mission.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. One thing, talking about Guy Gibson, going back to the Wellington, that Wellington was used as a camera plane during the filming of the Dam Busters.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, that was very nice. But yeah, so this is painted up to look like Guy Gibson's aircraft when he was killed in September 1944. So, what have we got next? Oh, I think we've mentioned this before, Mitch, but for the audience, me and Mitch play IL-2 IL-2 Great Battles, and one complaint about the Mosquito in that game is we don't get a 4,000 pounder. So there we are, we've got a 4,000 pounder now.
And this speaks to the versatility of the Mosquito. Again, those twin engine aircraft, like we were talking about with the 88 and the 410, these aircraft didn't play one role, and the fact that you could put a 4,000 pound bomb in a twin engine aircraft, and it can fly from a place like Duxford, England, all the way to Cologne, Germany, drop a payload like this and turn around and come home is nothing short of impressive for the time. And let's also point out the Mosquito, most of that airframe is made out of wood. So it's a very cost-effective aircraft as well.
I'd say that you can just pump these out as long as you want. And I think if they'd have come into service a bit sooner, they would have been even more useful and filled a lot of the gaps that the RAF desperately needed. And say, because it was, I want to put the Mosquito forward as probably the most, I don't want to say best, but most capable aircraft the RAF had during the war.
Well, I think after 1942, you look at a lot of operations, particularly when I think of like RAF operations in Western Europe, the Mosquito's the first plane I think of after 1942.
Yeah, and say before then, so it's the Spitfire, it's the Hurricane, that sort of thing. And say, but because the Mosquito, it doesn't get the love it deserves here in the UK. It's practically unknown. It's, for example, you look at the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. It's Spitfires, Hurricanes, and a Lancaster. That's it.
Well, and I think part of the so this is one of those things that I was thinking about with like, why does the Mustang get so much recognition And that's because, well, obviously it had a great combat record. The most important thing for legacy is, are they still around and how many are there?
Yeah.
So part of the problem with the Mosquito being made out of wood is that material it doesn't last over time. And so there was a long time, a couple decades, where there was only 1 or 2 flying Mosquitoes. And now there's more. There's probably 4 or 5 now. But that hurts a legacy, and it's too bad, because the Mosquito wore many hats throughout the war and played a very important role in the RAF going forward from 1942 onwards.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, if you take from the point of view of popular culture, yes, the Mosquitoes had two or three films made out of it. You've got
633 Squadron, Mosquito Squadron, and then there was a recent one on Netflix called The Bombardment.
That was it, yes. That's the raid on the prison, isn't it?
Yes, in Denmark.
Yeah. So you'd think that would do more for its reputation, but I just don't think we'd do enough for the Mosquito, really. But that's we spent enough time on the Mosquito, I think. So, Tempest. This pissed me off about the museum, because it's just shoved in a corner. I didn't see it until I walked in front of it. And so this particular Tempest, it was used by the Royal Indian Air Force in the late 40s into the early 50s. It was used against Pakistani forces in their war in 47. And then it was sold back to the museum. But yeah, a very terrific fighter, just shoved away in the corner. That is definitely forgotten, I think.
Well, I think part of that might have to do with that it's a Mark II.
Yeah.
And it's not that the Mark II is insignificant in any way. The World War II variant is the Mark V.
Yeah.
And I think there's only one of those. 1 or 2, not many. There's more Tempest Mark IIs, and in fact, as of last fall, there's now a flying Mark II in the UK.
Yes, there is, isn't there?
Yeah.
I want
very similar to the Sea Fury.
Yes. That is an aircraft that is never mentioned. I know we talk sometimes about obscure aircraft, but Sea Fury is it just doesn't get mentioned at all, really, does it?
Yeah, again, it's just one of those aircraft that was just a little too late for World War II.
Yeah. So, Avro Lincoln. Now, for context, I had some old pictures from many, many years ago. And for little baby me, well, 6 or 7-year-old me, this looked like a Lancaster to me. And I was going through the photos with Mitch one day a few months ago. And he said, hold on, that's a Lincoln. And we were both sort of in shock, because I didn't know this was here. And I didn't think there were any left, actually. And so I think there's, doing my research, I think there's about 5 or 6 left in total now. No, sorry, 8 or 9 left in total now. So this is, the Lincoln's I'm not sure how you describe it, a cousin, maybe? A son of the Lancaster?
Yeah, and improved, probably the next step up from the Lancaster. Yeah. One of these aircraft where, had the war continued with Japan, had there been an invasion of mainland Japan, you would have definitely seen these. It's one of those aircraft that falls in with like your Tempest Mark IIs, your F-8F Bearcats, your F-7F Tiger Cats. An aircraft that was within that summer 1945 time frame of getting ready to go on operational use, and then the war ends. And then it gets used in conflicts that are not as well known. So, like, I think these are part of the Malayan insurgency.
Yeah,
I would imagine.
In Malaya, you see a very few in Suez, Korea as well. They get used in. This particular model was with Coastal Command. It just served out its life in Coastal Command and then got sold to the museum.
Yeah, just one of those aircraft that was, 15 minutes too late.
Yeah.
By the time that the instrument of surrender was signed.
Exactly. Which, to be fair, actually is probably a good thing in hindsight.
Yeah.
But so this is a German rocket, which I don't even know how to begin to start pronouncing, and I don't know what it is either. But I thought it looked cool. And so I don't know if you know anything about it.
So this is a Rheinbote. The Rhine messenger artillery rocket was designed to replace or supplement the German Army's long-range heavy artillery and could deliver an 88-pound warhead to a distance of 99 miles from November 44 to May 1945. Over 200 were launched in the direction of the Belgian port of Antwerp, a key Allied base. I think part of the reason you don't hear much about these is because they were launched at one particular place.
Yeah.
And while they probably caused casualties, they just didn't make enough of an effect on target.
Yeah. And it's like for a weapon that is not going to be pinpoint accurate, you don't have the payload needed.
Yeah.
It's like, what's that? Yeah, 40 kilograms, 88 pounds. I know biplanes that carry more of a payload than that. It's just not worth it. Right. What's next? Right. 262. I'm going to try and speed this up now again. So me and Mitch were talking about this before. So there's one 262 here in the UK, another in, was it Uvalhazy?
Yeah, there's a fair number. There's probably a dozen or so that were used by the Luftwaffe that are still surviving examples today.
They're surprisingly more common than you'd expect, aren't
they?
What else we got? Right, Sidley Kestrel. I have no idea about this aircraft. I didn't even know it existed, and I don't think the museum care about it either because it's just shoved in the back in the back of the hangar. I've got absolutely no idea about it. And I don't know why it's also with the World War II stuff as well, but it's nice to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what we're looking at there is the Cold War hangar. Now, I don't know if you want to do a part 2 on this, or do you want to keep going?
Why don't we do a part 2, just because I got to get going here soon.
Okay, so we'll leave that for next time. So what we've just seen, that's all there, World War II and interwar period stuff. After this, the museum starts to go downhill a bit, but I think we'll discuss that in the next episode then.
So, well, and we can touch upon that. So aircraft that are suspended from ceilings. I think that's worth talking about.
Yes.
I'm typically not a fan of that. Not necessarily because if you do a good job and you don't leave them up there over time, the airframes won't get bent and twisted. I bring my camera to just about everywhere I go when I'm traveling, and so I'm an amateur photographer, and I prefer having aircraft sitting on the ground floor, or if they are elevated, they're sitting on some form of pedestal. I typically don't like it when they're mounted from a ceiling. Go ahead.
Carry on.
No,
I was just going to say, this is one thing I strongly disliked about this next hangar, is because not only is it all hanging from the ceiling.
Oh, well, go ahead and flip through some of the photos, because I got to see this.
So, hold on, let me go back on the tab. Right. So, hold on. I think... So that's one view of it.
Uh-huh.
No, sorry, wrong.
Oh, yeah, I can already see right there.
So there's your Vulcan.
Uh-huh.
How the hell am I going to see that?
Yeah.
And say, so as you can see, it's 2 stories there. The first picture on the left is taken, obviously I'm standing level with it, and I'm like, yeah, I can sort of get a good angle in it, but it's like, I want to try and get a better photo of the Vulcan. I can't, there's a bloody bloodhound in the way.
Yeah.
And if I turn to this picture, I mean, look at that.
That's too bad.
Yeah. And it's like, if I think I've got a picture here somewhere. Hold on. That lightning. That's been up there since I was a kid, and I first went there when I was about 6.
Uh-huh.
That hasn't moved. Ever. And I'm like, I dread to think in what state that's going to be in a few years' time.
Well, and I know that you've only got so much room to work with.
Yeah.
And it seems like this is the type this particular exhibit, they knew that there wasn't going to be a lot of movement There weren't going to be a lot of changes out of display, so it makes total sense.
But part of my argument with it is that this is where all the museum's money's gone. This is the most modern. If I flick back to, hold on, this. So as you can see there, it was opened in 2007.
Okay.
It's very, very new, and it's where all the money's gone because it just looks spectacular. And I don't know. I get that it's expensive, but I'm like, they should have done a bit more, I think. I would have been fine with a separate hangar. And I just wish there had been something different. Because I just don't like how it's set out at all.
And I guess, it's always better to have everything there than to not see it. But it is too bad that's the alternative way they have to go. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has an aviation wing, and every single one of those aircraft, and there's about a dozen planes in there, from B-17s to Spitfires and P-51s and Corsairs, and every single one of them is suspended from the ceiling.
Yeah. And so I think part of me would be okay seeing less stuff. It's because, like, you've got some Mini Coopers in there, you've got some, you've got some motorbikes, you've got lots of random stuff which it fits in with the cultural aspect they're trying to present of the of the Cold War, but it doesn't really have a place for the RAF Museum. I don't know why it was there. That should be some stuff that was in the visitor centre. So honestly, I could do without some of it, and that you'd free up space then. But we don't have to pay for it, so we can moan about it all.
So admission is totally free to this museum, right? Okay.
Completely free, apart from on special occasions. Like I went a few days before the air show at Cosford, and I think tickets were about £10-12, I think, something like that for adults. But that's only on special occasions. Mostly it's completely free, so I definitely recommend going. It's a very good museum. It's just there are some things that piss me off about it.
Now, was it an hour or 2 hours in the World War II hall, or was that in the whole thing?
That was the whole thing.
Okay.
But as I went into the last two hangars, I sort of sped up a bit because I got bored because there wasn't. Sure. And say, because for example, in the third hangar, which I'll show at some point, it's all the trainer aircraft, it's all the obscure stuff as well.
And
so, in fact, there is one thing I will show before we end this. One moment. James May's Airfix Spitfire.
Oh, that's a great one. That's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah,
that is so cool.
Actually, two things. So this is the second to last thing to end on. So I remember watching this as a kid. So James May, as when was it, 2009, I think it was, he did a show about kids' toys and everything like that, and one of them was Airfix models, and I've actually got one over there, but it's out of reach. And they're just little plastic models that you make, super glue, that sort of stuff. Do you have Airfix in the US?
So we mostly have, you can certainly order Airfix. Most of the models that you see here are Revell kits.
Okay, yeah, I know Revell. Yeah. And so it's a similar sort of thing. And James May wanted to, because it's a TV show and you obviously want to make things bigger and better, so he did basically a life-sized Spitfire model, but in plastic. That is completely plastic, and there's a few metal rods in very delicate places and in the wheels and stuff like that. But apart from that, it's all plastic, and that's an actual model which he sat for of himself. He had to. Have you seen that show?
Toy Stories of James May. Yeah, the whole thing's on YouTube. It's a really good watch, and
yes, it is.
He talks about his history of being a kid and getting into Airfix, and the idea was something that he came up with when he was a kid. And
we all had this idea as a kid.
It's a pretty cool journey of making this come to life, and it's neat that they still have this there at the museum.
Yeah, and because it's been there since I was a kid. I remember watching the show, and I went to the museum about a month later, and I get to see this, and I was so happy. And then one last thing. Oh, hold on. Firstly, the road that the museum's on, Horse Away. I love that.
Yeah.
And the last thing, Guy Gibson's VC. That for all the beautiful aircraft they've got and all that, for some reason that's most poignant to me. I know Guy Gibson gets a lot of credit, and perhaps not all of it's not all of it is perhaps should be aimed at him. But either way, he was certainly a very capable commander during Operation Chastise. And I think it's nice that they've still got his VCs somewhere, and I didn't know they were there. So I think that's the crowning glory for me personally.
So for the American audience who's unfamiliar with Guy Gibson,
if they're unfamiliar with Guy Gibson, sodom, they should read the history book.
Dam Busters was not a big. I don't think it was as big of a hit in America. That was a 1950s war movie about. Was that the Eater Dam that they had to bomb?
It was 3 dams: the Myrna, the Oder, and the Ada.
Okay. So there was Barnes Wallace was creating with a team was creating this
It's a bouncing bomb.
Bouncing bomb. Thank you. They could bounce off of water.
Yeah, it looks like a gasoline drum, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm saying it just skipped.
Yeah, and so this team up between Barnes Wallace trying to create this bouncing bomb that could effectively skip across the water and have enough detonation to rupture a dam was and teamed up with a wing commander, Guy Gibson, who flew Lancasters. And the whole movie is about creating the bomb, setting up the mission, and then executing the mission.
Yeah.
And Gibson is played by Richard Todd at the absolute peak of Richard Todd's career.
Oh, yeah.
And it is certainly worth watching. And hopefully, we'll get a remake of that. Peter Jackson still owns the rights to it, and I think he's just waiting for the technology to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think Stephen Fry's meant to be writing the script, but
and James Holland is a historical advisor on it.
And so, but hopefully that's something. Hopefully, after Masters of the Air, that's something that's more likely now.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think we'll come back to this another day then, because we've gone
that was
for
a cool
way
note to
longer
end
than
on.
we expected.
That's all right. There was a lot of cool stuff to talk. One thing I like about these museum visits is it allows us to go down these rabbit holes of things, like, we're ever going to have a soliloquy on the ME410. I mean, that was a really cool thing to see.
Yeah. I was going to say, because everything... There's just so much here that we gladly could have talked about this for hours easily, couldn't we?
Yeah.
And so I hopefully that the audience will forgive us for a longer episode than normal.
Yeah. Well, I hope that people are able to watch this on YouTube, because there's a lot of great pictures and information that you attach to this. So
yeah, I would definitely recommend watching this on YouTube.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Air War Podcast, presented by Pursuit Picks Media, and we will catch you guys next time. Thanks for watching.